Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tammy Heffelfinger, and I'm with the Division of Environmental Response and Revitalization here at Ohio EPA, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This morning's webinar is the Hazardous Waste Requirements, the Basics Part 1, and is part of Ohio EPA's 2020 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. These webinars will occur over a 3-week period from September 21st through October 8th. Please visit our conference webpage for more information about sessions you might have missed and to register for our upcoming sessions. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items to help you participate in today's event. On this slide, you will see a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. For this webinar, you are using your computer audio. If you're having sound issues, refresh your browser or log out and log back in. And if that doesn't work, check your computer audio settings. Please feel free to submit questions by typing them into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send your questions in at any time during the presentation. We will be answering them as we go through the presentation, as well as addressing some during the question and answer session of the presentation at the end. If we do not have time to answer your question, the presenter will reach out to you via email and assist with your question. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the presentation is available in the handouts section of your attendee interface. Once the webinar is edited, you will receive a link to the recording and a follow-up email, along with the session survey and a certificate of attendance. The session survey will also appear once the session is over. We would greatly appreciate it if you could take the time to complete the survey to let us know how we are doing or if there is anything we can do to further assist you. 1 hour of registered sanitarian and training continuing education units have been pre-approved for this session. This session is also pre-approved for PDHU credits and construction and demolition debris certified operators BMP credits. Attendees seeking American Planning Association credit may also do so through APA's self-reporting option. Log into your MyAPA account and select the self-reported credits option to receive credit. If you did not enter your member number when registering for the session, please make sure you provide us with your number through the Q&A feature. And if you're seeking other CEUs, check out our e-binder attached to today's webinar. As I mentioned, I will be the moderator for the session. I'm also going to be assisting with answering questions during the presentation. The presenter today is Kristie Shipley, and at this point, I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thanks, Tammy. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristie Shipley. I'm with the Division of Environmental Response and Revitalization's Hazardous Waste Program. And first, I just want to thank everyone for taking time out of your morning to participate in today's session on Ohio's hazardous waste rules. And before we get started, I do want to make you aware that we are close to adopting the federal hazardous waste generator improvements rules. We anticipate those being effective on October 5th. So that's going to change some of the requirements and the rule citations. I went ahead and updated the slides with that information, and I will let you know when we get to something that is part of the generator improvements rules. The purpose of this session is to provide you with the basic information that you need to know so that you're able to properly identify your waste streams to determine if they're hazardous, so that you know what type of generator requirements you need to adhere to. And hopefully by the end, you'll be able to recognize and avoid some of the most common hazardous waste violations. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, is what generates hazardous waste from the moment it's generated at a place of business until its final disposal. So in order to understand if you're subject to RCRA, you first need to know if you are generating a hazardous waste. And no matter what size business you are, you're required to identify all of your waste streams. It's important that a waste is not put into the general trash until you've both confirmed and demonstrated that it's not a hazardous waste. Ohio's hazardous waste laws specify that a generator is any person by site whose act or process or causes a hazardous waste to be subject to hazardous waste rules. So in order for a material to be hazardous waste, it first must meet the definition of a waste, which means it's a material that's going to be discarded either by disposal, burning, or by storing or treating that material instead of discarding it. A waste is also any material that's going to be recycled, either by applying it to the ground, burning it for energy recovery, or if it's speculatively accumulated, which just means that at least 75% of that material is not recycled in a calendar year. Certain things are not considered waste. So if they're specifically excluded by rule, which we'll go into here in a moment, or if the materials are going to be reused or reclaimed, they're not considered waste. But keep in mind that some materials, such as spent materials or listed byproducts, are considered waste even when they're reclaimed. Or as I mentioned before, if the material is going to be put on the ground, burned, or speculatively accumulated, it's still considered a waste. So some tools that you can use to make waste determinations include referencing the hazardous waste rules, which are located on the Ohio EPA's website. I'll also provide some links throughout the slides. You can collect a representative sample of your waste and send it for analysis to a lab, or you can just use your knowledge as a generator. Now, the rule doesn't specify what sources you can use as generator knowledge, nor does the US EPA provide any formal guidance, but some of the things that you can consider are your process inputs, so looking at your raw materials, contacting your vendors, seeing if they're able to provide you with any information. And you can also reference safety data sheets or SDSs. But something that you want to be careful of when using SDSs, they shouldn't be used as the sole determination, just more of a supportive document, because they don't always list all of the hazardous constituent levels. And of course, you need to document your evaluation and then keep that on file at your facility. So the basic questions you need to ask when making a waste determination are, is your waste excluded? Is your waste listed? There are 4 lists, the F, K, P, and U lists, which we'll talk here in a moment. And then also, does that waste exhibit a hazardous characteristic? So the first thing that you want to do is take a look at OAC Rule 3745-5104, which is linked here. This rule lists and describes all of the specific wastes that are excluded from hazardous waste regulations, as well as any conditions that they need to meet. So there's about 34 pages of exclusions, and I've listed some of the common ones here on this slide. But I also wanted to mention solvent-contaminated wipes, because I think that's a pretty common industrial waste stream. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail in the presentation this afternoon. So just a heads up if that's something that you're interested in learning more about. So if your waste doesn't meet an exclusion, you want to take a look at the 4 hazardous waste lists. The first one that we're going to talk about is the F list, which comes from non-specific sources. It just means that it can be generated from a wide range of manufacturing processes. Some common examples are spent solvents such as trichloroethylene, toluene, or xylene, as well as electroplating operation waste such as wastewater treatment sludges, plating baths, and residues. So this is a snapshot of the F-list table. You can see that the waste codes are listed here on the left-hand side. In the middle column is just a description of the waste that fall into this category. And in the right-hand side is the hazard code, which just indicates why that waste belongs to the list. And in the case of the ones on this slide, T stands for toxic waste and I is ignitable, but you may see several other hazard codes listed. The next list is the K list, which is industry specific. So common examples include spent pot liners from primary aluminum reduction, as well as emission control dust and sludges from steel production. So here's a table showing some of the K-listed wastes, and you can see by this middle column here where the description is that these are both very source and industry specific. For example, K002 is just for wastewater treatment sludge from the production of chrome yellow and orange pigments. And all of the ones on this slide are T for toxic waste. And the final two lists are the P and U lists, which contain unused, discarded commercial chemical products. The key word here is that they're unused. So if this is something that was generated after going through a manufacturing process, it's not going to meet that definition anymore. And the only difference between the two lists is that the P list contains acute hazardous waste, which are more dangerous in smaller quantities. So we've reached our first interactive poll question, and this one is just a quick knowledge check to gauge how much you might already understand before we talk about characteristic hazardous waste. A waste with a pH of less than 2 or greater than 12.5 is 1, ignitable, 2, reactive, 3, corrosive, or 4, toxic.
Polls have been launched. If you do not see it yet, it should pop up in a second. Please make your selections now. We have about 60% of the people have responded. If you have not already responded, please do so now. We will be closing the polls momentarily. The polls have been closed. It looks like the majority responded C, corrosive, and now I'll hand it back over to Kristie.
That's correct. So most of you understand this already. That's great. So now we're going to talk about the final step in making a hazardous waste determination. A waste can be hazardous if it exhibits a certain characteristic, meaning it could be ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic. Ignitable wastes are assigned the D001 waste code. These are liquids with the flash point of less than 140 degrees, which includes solvents and degreasers. Solids that spontaneously ignite, such as some metal swarfs, as well as ignitable compressed gases and oxidizers. Corrosive hazardous waste carry the D002 waste code. These are acids and bases, aqueous solutions with a pH of less than 2 or greater than 12.5. And these are liquids that can corrode steel at a specified rate. So you really want to know if your waste is corrosive because it's going to determine what type of container that you use to store it. Some examples include spent sulfuric acid, alkaline cleaning fluids, waste battery acids, as well as sodium hydroxide. Reactive hazardous waste will carry the D003 waste code, and these are extremely unstable. They can be explosive, they can react violently with water. Some common examples include ammonium nitrate, dynamite, and waste peroxides. And the fourth category of characteristic hazardous waste is toxicity. And unlike the previous three that we discussed, which have the potential to cause more of an immediate harm, toxic hazardous waste can cause long-term harm by contaminating groundwater. The waste codes range from D004 to D043. To determine if your waste is toxic, you want to take a representative sample of your waste and send it to a lab for a T-clip analysis, which is the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure. And this is where the lab will simulate landfill conditions to determine how much will leach out. And if the waste contains toxic constituents equal to or greater than the regulatory levels, then you have a waste characteristic of toxicity. There are 8 metals and 32 organics in this category. And this table shows the 8 RCRA metals. You can see their waste codes or waste numbers in that left-hand column and their regulatory limit levels in milligrams per liter in the right. So one thing to pay attention to when you get your lab results is just to make sure that your units match so that you don't have to do any conversions. So let's just take a moment to recap the determination process. First, is your waste excluded? If it is, then you don't have a hazardous waste. If not, you need to move on to examining the 4 lists. And as you can see by this table, even if you have a listed hazardous waste, you still need to determine if it also exhibits any hazardous characteristics. So it's not an either or thing, you need to do both. If your waste isn't listed or characteristic, then you're done. You need to just keep that determination on file. So once you've determined you have a hazardous waste, now you need to determine what size generator you are, because that's going to dictate what requirements you need to follow. Here in Ohio, we have 3 different categories that are based on how much you generate in a calendar month and also how much you store on site. Very small quantity generator, or VSQG, will replace the previous term of conditionally exempt small quantity generator. That's something that's going to be changing with the generator improvement rules. We also have small quantity generator, which I'll refer to as SQG, and large quantity generator, which I'll refer to as LQG. So let's just take a minute and see what size generators we have with us today. Select 1 for LQG, 2 for SQG, or 3 for VSQG.
All right, the second poll has been launched. It should pop up in a second. If you don't see it, please make your selections. All right, we're at about 60%, so if you haven't answered, please do so now. We'll be closing the polls momentarily. And the polls have been closed. It looks like, well, it's a pretty even distribution. I'm going to turn it back over to Kristie now.
All right, thanks, guys. So when determining your category, you need to count the total weight of the hazardous waste that's generated at your facility in a calendar month. And it's not based on an average or how much was shipped off in a month. I think that's a misconception. It needs to be based on how much is actually generated. And VSQGs and SQGs are also limited to what they can store on site, so you'll want to pay attention to those numbers as well. When a generator is determining its generator category, it needs to consider 3 relevant types of hazardous waste or non-acute hazardous waste for purposes of this discussion, acute hazardous waste, and residues from cleanup or the spill of acute hazardous waste. And in 3 of the 5 possible scenarios, the generator will be an LQG, in 1 scenario, an SQG, and in 1 scenario, a VSQG. And please note, when you're calculating your generator category, the quantities of acute hazardous waste and non-acute hazardous waste need to be considered separately. VSQGs generate up to 220 pounds of hazardous waste in a month and never store more than 2,200 pounds of hazardous waste on site. And something that you want to pay attention to if you're a VSQG or think you may be a VSQG is, I'll take you back to this other table here. This bottom row shows that if you generate 1 kilogram, which is about 2.2 pounds of acute hazardous waste in a calendar month, that's going to actually bump you up to a large quantity generator. And just for reference, 220 pounds is about half of a 55-gallon drum, and 2,200 pounds is about 5 55-gallon drums. But that, of course, is going to vary depending on the density of your waste. The VSQG rule is going to be moving locations to 37, 45, 52, 14, and there's going to be a new rule, 5213, that outlines all of the things that generators need to consider when determining their category. And that table that I showed 2 slides back is going to be located in that rule. So sometimes there's a spill or a clean out that may put you over your category limit. What happens in those situations? Well, your generator category is going to change for that month that it's generated. You're either going to be an SQG, or if it's more than 2,200 pounds, you'll be an LQG. And if you store more than 2,200 pounds of hazardous waste, you'll remain an SQG until that hazardous waste is shipped off site. The next category is SQG. You'll fall into this category if you generate more than 220 pounds, but less than 2,200 pounds of hazardous waste in a calendar month. You're also limited to the amount stored on site at any given time, which is 13,200 pounds. Now, going over the limits as an SQG is a little bit different than a VSQG. You're going to be an LQG until the waste is moved up. You're going to be an LQG until that waste is moved off-site, not just for that month that it was generated. And if you accumulate over 13,200 pounds on site, you become subject to hazardous waste permitting. You would be considered a treatment, storage, and disposal facility, or a TSDF. LQGs generate 2,200 pounds or more of hazardous waste, and there is no limit on how much can be stored on site. Episodic generation is the term we use when a generator occasionally generates hazardous waste, occasionally fluctuates between those three categories, or if they routinely change their generator category at least once a month in a calendar year, maybe because something like a tank cleanout. So under the current regulation, if you have an episodic event, you need to manage that hazardous waste under the applicable generator requirements for whatever category you've bumped up into. And if you reach large quantity generator status during an odd year, you need to file a biennial report in that next even year. However, under the new generator improvement rules, you'll be allowed to have 2 episodic events per year without changing your generator category. But you can only have 1 planned and 1 unplanned event, and you do need to submit a petition for that second event. Now, the EPA has determined that limiting the unplanned event to just 1 will ensure that the episodic generation provision isn't used in a way to create an incentive for irresponsible management of hazardous waste. A planned event is pretty self-explanatory. This is something that was prepared for, and it can include waste that were generated from a variety of activities, such as performing regular maintenance, tanker process equipment cleanouts, short-term projects, or if you're doing a facility-wide cleanout of unused or out-of-date chemicals. Unplanned events are the exact opposite. This is when something unexpected happens. So maybe there's an abrupt change in your production process, or you have a very large spill. When you're preparing for your episodic event, you want to keep in mind that you need to notify the Ohio EPA at least 30 days prior by submitting Form 9029, which is also referred to as the RCRA Site ID form. This is the form that you submit to notify of your generator category as well. For unplanned events, you need to notify Ohio EPA within 72 hours by phone, email, or fax, and also submit Form 9029. A second event in a calendar year will require the submittal of a petition, which is just an addendum to the Site ID form. You need to explain why that second event is needed, provide the estimated amount of hazardous waste that will be generated, and explain how that hazardous waste will be managed, as well as the timeframe to complete. Now, keep in mind you're limited to 60 days because the EPA has determined that anything more than 60 days isn't really an episodic event, and you should be managing your waste in a higher generator category. And finally, the petition also needs to include details on that previous event. So while you're storing the waste that was generated from an episodic event on site, the containers need to be labeled as episodic hazardous waste. And you need to keep records to identify the start date. So the easiest way might just be to label that container to ensure that it's shipped off within 60 days of that start date. And the final bullet point is important if you're VSQG, because when we get into the specific requirements, you'll notice that they're not required to use a manifest, but this is an exception. If it's from an episodic event, you need to use a manifest, and it needs to be sent to a permitted treatment, storage, and disposal facility. Now we're going to get into the specific requirements that generators need to follow. If you generate a waste, you must determine if your waste is hazardous. And OAC Rule 3745-5211 provides you with step-by-step procedures to follow when making this determination. And the failure to properly evaluate your waste may lead to unsafe management, treatment, or disposal of your hazardous waste. So this is why it's very important to evaluate all of your waste streams. The new rule specifies that a waste determination needs to be made at the point of generation, prior to any dilution or mixing or alteration. This is because that will change the properties of the waste, and anytime the properties change, a new determination needs to be made. And just another reminder to hold off on throwing waste into the dumpster until you've demonstrated that the waste is not hazardous. If you generate, treat, store, or dispose of hazardous waste, or if you store recyclable materials prior to recycling them, you may be required to obtain a US EPA Identification Number and notify Ohio EPA of your hazardous waste activity. If you're a VSQG, you're not required to obtain an ID number, but SQGs and LQGs need one. And keep in mind, ID numbers are site-specific. So if your company has more than one site that's required to obtain a number, you need to submit a form for each individual site. And if your company moves to another location and is still required to have an ID number, you're going to need to submit a new form for that location. And this is because the ID number is tied to a physical location. So we do request that you submit a letter to deactivate your old number. Under the new rule, SQGs need to re-notify every 4 years by submitting Form 9029 by September 1st, every 4 years beginning next year. LQGs need to re-notify March 1st of even numbered years, which is the same time that the biennial report is due, so it can just be done as part of that report. All generators need to follow marking and labeling requirements. The containers need to be marked with the words hazardous waste and an indication of the hazards. This is the new requirement under the generator improvement rules. And examples of how to indicate the hazards include just writing the words of the hazardous waste characteristic on the container, such as ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic. You can use a hazard communication consistent with DOT, a hazard statement or pictogram consistent with OSHA's hazard communication standard, or a chemical hazard label consistent with NFPA. And more than likely, many of you are already complying with one or more of those types of labels. Satellite accumulation refers to a stored location where your hazardous waste initially accumulates as you're generating it. And the satellite accumulation rule only applies to SQGs and LQGs. And the rule stipulates that each satellite accumulation area can have up to 55 gallons of hazardous waste per waste stream, or 1 quart of acute hazardous waste. And the container needs to be located at or near the point of generation and under the control of the operator of the process. And this will hopefully prevent the addition of incompatible waste into that container, as well as prevent untrained employees from coming into contact with that waste. The containers used to store the waste need to be compatible with the contents. For example, you wouldn't want to store sulfuric acid in an unlined steel drum that could cause it to corrode. And the containers need to be in good condition, so no dents, bulges, or leaks. Marking and labeling requirements apply to satellite containers, so they need to be labeled as hazardous waste with an indication of the hazards. The satellite containers need to be kept closed except for when you're actively adding or removing hazardous waste, or if you need to temporarily vent that container, maybe to prevent a buildup of pressure. We have our next poll question. So once your 55-gallon satellite accumulation area container is full, how long can it remain in that location? Select 1 for 10 days, 2 for 30 days, or 3 for 3 days.
All right, we've launched the poll, so submit your answers now. At this point, we've reached about 60%, so if you haven't submitted your answer yet, please do so soon. All right, the polls have been closed. Oh, we got a tie for 2 answers. Kristie, I'll let you discuss the results.
Well, the correct answer is 3 days. So once the container is full, it needs to be moved to the central accumulation area within 3 days. The container needs to be dated, and then you need to comply with the accumulation requirements for the 180-day or 90-day storage time limit. Once your waste reaches your central accumulation area, if you're an SQG or an LQG, you're limited to the number of days that you can store it. Now, VSQGs don't have any storage time limits, but keep in mind, if you accumulate more than 2,200 pounds of hazardous waste on site at any one time, you become subject to the SQG requirements until that waste is shipped off. SQGs, if you accumulate waste for longer than 180 or 270 days, you need to get a hazardous waste permit. And if you encounter unforeseen, temporary, or uncontrollable circumstances in getting your waste shipped off by that deadline, you can request a 30-day extension from the Director of the Ohio EPA by reaching out to your district office. LQGs, once the hazardous waste is generated, it can't be kept on site for more than 90 days. And LQGs need to maintain strict compliance with this 90-day time frame because exceeding the allowable accumulation period can cause a generator to potentially be classified as an illegal hazardous waste storage facility. And again, if you encounter unforeseen or uncontrollable circumstances in getting that waste shipped off, you can request a 30-day extension. So generators may want to treat their hazardous waste on site for a variety of reasons, maybe to render it less hazardous, make it easier to recover, store, or transport, or even just to reduce the volume. And it's important to understand what's permissible for you to do as a generator. I've linked a guidance document on this slide that has a lot of good information if that's something that you're considering doing at your facility. But in general, there are a few types of treatment that are allowed. So you can perform neutralization, polymerization, stabilization, and wastewater treatment. The treatment needs to be done in tanks, containers, on drip pads, or in containment buildings. You're not allowed to conduct any thermal treatment or land disposal. And keep in mind that 180-day or 90-day time frame applies as you're treating your hazardous waste. And it's always a good idea to reach out to someone here at the Ohio EPA if you have any questions before you treat your hazardous waste on site. So now we're going to move into container management. The key to properly identifying whether you have a tank or container hinges on the characteristics of that unit, so whether it's portable or stationary, and how that unit is used at your facility. So if you don't use it to move hazardous waste, it's most likely a tank. If the unit is used to collect material in one location and then it's moved to another location, it's a container. The container management requirements only apply to SQGs and LQGs. The containers need to be in good condition, so no signs of dents, bulges, corrosion, or visible leaks. The containers need to be compatible with the waste that's being stored, and they need to be properly labeled with the words hazardous waste and an indication of the hazards. Lids need to be kept closed except for when you're adding or removing waste or temporarily venting the container, and the container areas need to be inspected weekly. Containers in the central accumulation area need to be labeled with an accumulation start date, and proper aisle space needs to be maintained. Ignitable and reactive waste need to be located 50 feet from the property line. However, the new rules will allow LQGs to get a waiver from their fire department. And if you're an LQG, the containers also need to comply with the US EPA air emission standards. So here's an example of good container management. You can see the drums are labeled. There appears to be a DOT label on them indicating they're flammable. There are no signs of dents or leaks, and there is space between those rows to maneuver emergency equipment if needed. The tank management requirements also only apply to SQGs and LQGs. And there are many requirements for LQGs who store hazardous waste in tanks. So I've linked a guidance document that provides a lot of good information on that subject. If you're an LQG, you may want to take a look at that. And the rule citations are also going to change with the new generator improvement rules. For SQGs who manage hazardous waste in tanks, you can accumulate up to 999 kilograms of hazardous waste in tanks for up to 180 or 270 days without a permit, as long as you never accumulate more than 6,000 kilograms of hazardous waste on site at any time. You need to have a tracking system to ensure that the waste has not been accumulated in the tank for more than 180 or 270 days. The tanks need to be labeled as hazardous waste and an indication of the hazards. The tank structure needs to be in good condition and made of a material that's compatible with the waste. The discharge control equipment and data gathered from monitoring equipment, such as the pressure and temperature, needs to be inspected daily. Hazardous waste or treatment reagents shouldn't be placed in the tank if they could cause the tank or its inner liner to rupture, to leak, corrode, or fail before the end of its intended life. And upon closure of the facility, the hazardous waste needs to be removed from the tank, as well as from the discharge control equipment and from discharge confinement structures. So since the rules for LQG storing hazardous waste in tanks are lengthy, we've just listed a brief summary here on the slides. You'll want to refer to the full rule for all of the requirements. LQGs can accumulate hazardous waste in tanks for up to 90 days without a permit. The tanks need to be labeled as hazardous waste and also with an indication of the hazards. And the tanks need to be inspected daily to identify any leaks, deterioration, corrosion, or structural fatigue in any portion of the tanker system components. Additionally, they need to be equipped with secondary containment and a leak detection system to allow for the detection of leaks from the primary or inner tank while providing a secondary barrier to contain releases and also prevent them from entering the environment and provide protection from spills or operational errors such as overfilling. The tanks need to be certified by a professional engineer, and upon closure of the facility, hazardous waste needs to be removed from the tank, as well as from the discharge control equipment and from the discharge confinement structures. And LQGs need to comply with the applicable federal hazardous waste air emission standards. The generator requirement summary table that I've linked on this slide is a very helpful comprehensive overview of the rules. So it breaks down all of the requirements, and then it indicates whether a VSQG, SQG, or LQG needs to comply with that. And it also links back to the rule citations. So before we head into questions, we have one final poll question. Can you spot the violations that an inspector would cite for this hazardous waste container?
All right, the polls have been launched. They should show up in a minute. Please submit your answers. All right, we have about 60% of the people have voted. Please submit your answers soon. We'll be closing the poll shortly. All right, the poll has been closed, and it appears the majority of the people have chosen D, all of the above. Kristie?
Okay, great. So you can see by looking at the container, it doesn't have any hazardous waste label on there, no indication of the hazards. The container is also full, so it doesn't have an accumulation start date, and the container is open. So great answers. All right, so now we're going to stop and see if we have any questions that are left. I know they've been answered during the presentation a little bit.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and begin the Q&A session. As a reminder, you can still continue to submit questions through the questions pane in the attendee control panel. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. But if you don't hear your question, we'll be reaching out to you after the conference. And you can always email Kristie as well if you would like to ask a more detailed question after the session. So, Kristie, our first question. What happens if I have 3 episodic events in a year?
Okay, so if you've already had both your planned and unplanned events, so meaning that you've submitted your notifications and followed those instructions, for that third event, you're going to need to manage that waste for whatever under whatever generator category you've bumped up into. And something to consider if you are having that many episodic events, that you might need to be operating in a higher generator category that's more reflective of your activities.
Okay. The next question is, do we need to label hazardous waste containers with the contents? For example, hazardous waste solvents. And do we need to put waste codes on the containers?
Okay, so the containers don't need to be labeled with the contents. They just need to be labeled with the words hazardous waste and an indication of the hazards of those contents. And the waste codes only need to be put on there prior to shipping.
Okay. The next question. Do small containers that will be lab packed need to be labeled individually?
Okay, so the individual containers don't need to be labeled, but the larger lab pack container, that needs to be labeled properly.
Our question here. If we are a VSQG and want to send our hazardous waste to a sister facility that is an LQG, are we able to transport it ourselves?
Okay, so the EPA doesn't require the use of a manifest for this, and you don't need to use a hazardous waste transporter, but there still might be DOT requirements for hazardous materials.
Okay. Well, we want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. This was the Hazardous Waste Requirements, the Basics Part 1. If you have additional questions, you can contact Kristie directly or continue to chat them in. You can also contact our office. As I mentioned earlier, once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation. We would appreciate it if you would complete that to provide us your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar, a certificate of attendance, and another link to the survey in case you don't get a chance to complete it now. And we want to thank you again for joining us this morning. And don't forget that Part 2 is at 2 o'clock this afternoon. We hope you're able to participate in more of Ohio EPA's Virtual Compliance Conference. Have a great day.